When did you do the wrong thing for the right reasons? Our school had zero tolerance for physical contact between students. My autistic little brother went to the same high school in the special ed program. When he had sensory overloads, he needed deep pressure hugs to regulate. Without them, his meltdowns lasted hours instead of minutes. And at school, I couldn't touch him because of the rule. I tried teaching him coping strategies that didn't involve touch. We practiced breathing exercises, bought him a weighted vest, tried everything the occupational therapist suggested. But nothing worked as well as the pressure hugs he'd relied on his whole life. I started meeting him in the special ed room during his lunch to check on him, watching for signs of overload so I could alert his aide before things got bad. His aide was this older woman who meant well but didn't understand autism at all. She'd try to calm him by talking louder, which made everything worse. She'd turn the lights on full brightness because she thought he needed to see clearly, not understanding that fluorescent lights made him feel like his skin was burning. When he started rocking or flapping his hands, she'd tell him to have quiet hands and try to physically stop him from stimming, which just accelerated his meltdowns. I wrote out detailed instructions for what my brother needed, but the aide said she had her own training and didn't need advice from a teenager. I tried talking to the special ed coordinator, but she said they had protocols and couldn't make exceptions. My parents had fought this battle so many times they'd given up, exhausted from years of IEP meetings that changed nothing. My brother was regressing from the constant stress of school. He'd started hitting himself during meltdowns, something he hadn't done since he was 7, leaving bruises on his temples that made me sick to see. He'd lost 10 pounds because he couldn't eat when he was anxious, and he was anxious every single day knowing he'd have to face school without the one tool that helped him cope. What was really awful was that my brother knew I was right there in the same building but couldn't help him. He'd cry for me during his meltdowns, saying my name over and over, and the aide would tell him I was in class and couldn't come. She'd report this to my parents as attention-seeking behavior, rather than recognizing it as a genuine need for the one person who knew how to help him. Some days I could hear him screaming from my classroom 2 hallways away, and I'd have to sit there pretending to focus on algebra while my brother's world fell apart. During state testing week, the schedule was different, and my brother's routine was completely disrupted. I knew it would be bad, so I'd warned his aide that he'd need extra support. She said she had it handled and told me to focus on my own tests. About halfway through my English exam, I heard screaming from down the hall that I recognized immediately as my brother. It wasn't his normal upset sound, but the high-pitched keening that meant he was hurting himself. I asked to use the bathroom and instead went to the special ed room. My brother was on the floor, slamming his head against the tile while the aide stood there telling him to stop. His forehead was already bleeding, and he was making this keening sound that meant he was completely gone into panic mode. 2 other aides were trying to physically restrain him, which was making him fight harder, his arms pinned while his head was still free to slam against the floor. They'd cleared the other kids out, but I could see them watching through the door window, terrified. One little girl was crying, and I recognized her as another autistic student who was probably about to melt down from the chaos. I pushed past the aide and dropped to the floor next to my brother. I said his name low and steady, the way he needed to hear it, and his eyes found mine through the blood running down his face. He reached for me, sobbing, and I knew I had maybe seconds before he started hurting himself again. I wrapped him in the tightest hug I could manage, applying pressure across his back and shoulders exactly how he needed it, the way I'd done 1,000 times at home. He went limp against me, his breathing starting to sync with mine. I held him like that while the aide yelled at me about the no contact rule, about liability, about protocol. Within 3 minutes, my brother was calm. The bleeding on his forehead had stopped being fresh, though his face was still covered in blood. He was humming quietly, the first 4 notes of a song our mom used to sing, which meant he was regulating. I kept holding him because I knew if I let go too soon, he'd spiral again. The principal showed up with security, and I heard him tell someone to call CPS about an incident requiring documentation. I stayed with my brother until my parents arrived, not letting go even when the principal said I was in violation of school policy. My mom cried when she saw the blood on his face, and my dad had to be physically stopped from confronting the aide who'd let it get that bad. 2 days later, a CPS worker showed up at our house with a clipboard and a very serious expression. My parents thought she was there to investigate the school for letting my brother hurt himself. Instead, she looked directly at me and said she needed to ask me some questions about inappropriate physical contact with a minor. The school reported that you engaged in non-consensual physical restraint of a vulnerable student, she said, reading from her notes. We need to discuss whether you should have unsupervised access to your brother. My stomach dropped to the floor as I sat down across from her at our scratched kitchen table. The CPS worker clicked her pen 3 times before writing the date at the top of a form. My parents sat frozen on either side of me like they'd been hit by a truck. Dad's knuckles went white as he gripped the edge of the table. Mom kept opening and closing her mouth without making any sound. The worker's clipboard had a thick stack of papers underneath the top form. I could see the school's letterhead peeking out from the edges. She tapped her pen against the clipboard and waited for me to answer her question about unsupervised access. I took a shaky breath and pulled out my phone to show her videos I'd taken over the years. The first one showed my brother during a meltdown at home before I gave him deep pressure. He was hitting his head against the wall while screaming. Then the video showed me wrapping him in a tight hug from behind. Within 30 seconds, his body went from rigid to relaxed. His screaming stopped and he started humming. I swiped to the next video showing the same pattern. The worker wrote notes without looking up from her clipboard. She asked why I thought I knew better than trained professionals. I explained that deep pressure therapy wasn't something I made up. I pulled out a folder I'd kept from his occupational therapist with diagrams showing exactly how to apply pressure. The papers had official letterhead and the therapist's signature. The worker took the folder and flipped through it quickly. She wrote more notes and underlined something twice. When I mentioned the blood running down his forehead, she looked up for the first time. Her pen stopped moving. She asked why the staff couldn't handle the situation properly. I described how they'd pinned his arms while leaving his head free to slam against the floor. Her eyebrows went up slightly, but she kept her face neutral. She wrote something in the margin of her form. Dad's jaw muscle twitched when she suggested I might have made things worse. His chair scraped against the floor as he shifted forward. The worker pulled out a yellow form with safety plan printed at the top. She started checking boxes boxes about supervised visits and restricted contact. Mom made a small choking sound, and tears started rolling down her cheeks. She grabbed a napkin from the holder and pressed it against her eyes. The worker kept checking boxes like she was making a grocery list. My hands started shaking as I watched her fill out the form that could keep me away from my brother. She said she needed to interview him directly about what happened. I explained that he goes nonverbal when he's stressed and wouldn't be able to answer questions. She insisted it was protocol and stood up from the table. We followed her down the hallway to my brother's room where he was sitting on his bed rocking back and forth. He was wearing his weighted vest and holding his favorite stuffed dinosaur. The worker sat on his desk chair and pulled it closer to the bed. She asked him his name, but he just kept rocking and humming the same 4 notes. She asked if he remembered what happened at the school. He started flapping his hands, which meant his anxiety was getting worse. She kept asking questions about whether he wanted me to hug him and if he felt safe. Each question made him rock faster and hum louder. Mom stepped forward like she wanted to intervene, but the worker held up her hand. After 10 minutes of getting no response, she gave up and wrote, "Unable to obtain statement," in large letters. She said she'd need to file her report within 48 hours. We walked back to the kitchen where she gathered her papers and put them in a briefcase. She left a business card on the table and said she might need to come back. The front door clicked shut, and we sat there in silence for a full minute. Then Dad slammed his fist on the table, making the salt shaker jump. That evening, while we were eating leftover pizza, an email notification popped up on my phone. The subject line said, "Disciplinary hearing notice" from the school. My hands trembled as I opened it and read about the hearing scheduled for next week. They listed 2 violations, including leaving an exam without permission and violating the no-contact policy. There's something deeply unsettling about how the school reported this as non-consensual physical restraint when the brother was literally bleeding from his own self-harm. Makes me wonder what exactly the aide wrote in her report to twist the situation this badly. The email said I could face suspension or other disciplinary action. Mom read it over my shoulder and immediately said we needed a lawyer. Dad pulled out his laptop and started searching for education attorneys in our area. The cheapest consultation fee was $300, which we didn't have. Mom mentioned her cousin knew someone who might help, but Dad said we couldn't wait for maybes. I told them I'd handle it myself and went to my room before they could argue. I stayed up until 3 in the morning pulling together every document I could find about deep pressure therapy. My laptop screen made my eyes burn, but I kept searching medical journals and therapy websites. I found studies showing how deep pressure reduces cortisol and increases serotonin in autistic individuals. I downloaded occupational therapy reports from when my brother was 5 that recommended pressure input. I found articles from autism organizations explaining why deep pressure works. My printer ran out of ink halfway through, so I had to save everything to a flash drive. I organized the documents into categories with labels like medical evidence and therapeutic recommendations. The stack of papers grew until it was 3 inches thick. The next morning, I searched online forums for help and found someone mention Bridger Lyons from a local disability nonprofit. I called him right away and explained everything that happened with my brother. He listened without interrupting, then asked me to email him my brother's IEP. Within an hour, he called back saying there was no sensory plan documented anywhere in the paperwork. He said this was a huge problem because the school couldn't claim they were following his plan if no plan existed. We spent 2 hours on the phone while he helped me write a formal request for an emergency IEP meeting to add sensory accommodations. He told me to send it by email with read receipts turned on, so the school couldn't claim they never got it. We sent it that night, and I watched the read receipt come back showing the principal opened it at 9:30. 2 days later, the CPS worker showed up again without warning while I was eating breakfast. This time, she wanted to talk about what she called my pattern of control over my brother. She asked if I thought I knew better than trained professionals. I stayed calm and told her that boundaries don't matter when someone is splitting their head open on the floor. She wrote down everything I said and scheduled another visit for next week. After she left, I started keeping a detailed log of every meltdown my brother had at the school. I compared the ones where he got pressure input from me or mom at home to the ones at the school where he didn't. The difference was obvious, with home meltdowns lasting 3 minutes while school ones went for 2 hours. I took pictures of every bruise and scratch the school's proper handling left on him. My phone filled up with photos of purple marks on his wrists from restraints and red scratches on his arms from when he hurt himself. That afternoon, I got an email from a parent whose daughter was the crying girl who saw everything. She said her daughter had been having nightmares about the blood on my brother's face. The parent wanted to help and offered to write a statement about how the school's approach traumatized other students too. I forwarded her email to Bridger, who said witness statements from other parents would be really helpful. He suggested we write a proposal showing concrete alternatives the school could use instead of restraints. We spent the weekend putting together a document with specific products like compression vests and squeeze machines. We included links to training programs for staff and added up all the costs to show it wasn't that expensive. The total came to less than what the school spent on new football uniforms last year. Monday morning, the principal's secretary called me out of math class. I walked into his office and he told me I was banned from the special ed wing while they investigated the incident. He said I couldn't check on my brother during lunch anymore because of safety concerns and liability issues. I sat there thinking about whose safety he was really protecting while he talked about protocols. I asked if my brother would still be allowed to find me if he needed help. The principal said no contact meant no contact, and my brother would have to learn to cope without me. I left his office feeling sick, but then I had an idea. I found Bryant after school and asked if he'd be willing to pass information to the special ed staff. He agreed to be my messenger, even though we both knew it wasn't the same as me being there. I printed out articles about autism and sensory needs and gave them to him in a folder. He promised to leave them in the staff room where the aide might actually read them. That evening, I called our pediatrician's office and explained what was happening at the school. She was horrified when I told her about the restraints and my brother hitting his head. She agreed to write a letter stating that deep pressure was a medical intervention for his sensory processing disorder. She said she'd include specific recommendations and warnings about what happens when he doesn't get the sensory input he needs. The letter arrived by fax 2 days later, and it was strongly worded about the medical necessity of pressure therapy. I made 20 copies and gave them to my parents to include with every piece of correspondence. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, I had to prepare my statement for the disciplinary hearing coming up. I wrote down just the facts about what happened without getting emotional. I practiced reading it out loud over and over until I could get through it without my voice shaking. My parents helped me revise parts that sounded too angry or accusatory. We changed phrases like the aide let him hurt himself to my brother was injured while under supervision. Every edit made it sound less like blame and more like concern for my brother's needs. I printed the final version on good paper and put it in a folder with all my documentation. The stack of evidence kept growing with medical articles and therapy recommendations and witness statements. I organized everything with labeled tabs so I could find what I needed quickly during the hearing. My brother came to my room that night and lay down next to me on the bed. He hummed the first notes of Mom's song while I rubbed his back in slow circles. I knew tomorrow would be hard, but at least I had proof that what I did was right. 3 nights later, we were eating spaghetti when the doorbell rang, and Mom went to answer it while my brother kept twirling his fork in the same pattern he always did. The CPS worker walked into our kitchen without waiting for an invitation and pulled out her clipboard while we were still holding our forks. She watched me cut my brother's meatball into smaller pieces because he couldn't handle big chunks and wrote something down. My brother started rocking when the stranger sat at our table, and I got up to grab his weighted vest from the hook by the door. The worker's pen moved across her paper as I helped him put it on and adjusted the weight distribution across his shoulders. She asked if I always did things for him that he could do himself, and I explained he needed help with the vest's buckles. My dad's face turned red when she asked if I thought I knew better than the professionals at his school. Mom squeezed his hand under the table while I stayed calm and said I just knew my brother's specific needs. The worker stayed for another hour watching us finish dinner and taking notes about every interaction between me and my brother. The next morning, Bridger called with news that made my hands shake with relief. He'd spent all night reading through district policies and found that the zero-tolerance rule had exceptions they never mentioned. The policy actually said physical contact was prohibited except in cases of medical necessity or safety concerns. He'd found 3 other districts that had been sued for preventing siblings from helping with medical needs and lost. One case involved twins where one had epilepsy, and the school got fined for not letting his brother help during seizures. Bridger emailed me copies of all the cases highlighted with the parts that matched our situation. We met with Cedric Keller at his small office downtown where stacks of paper covered every surface. He could only give us 2 hours of free help, but explained our options clearly. We could file a complaint with the state education department or go through the office for civil rights. The state complaint would probably get results in 3 to 6 months, while OCR could take over a year. He said the state complaint was our best bet since they had to investigate within 60 days by law. My parents and I spent the whole weekend debating which route to take while my brother played with his trains. We finally decided on the state complaint because waiting a year for OCR seemed impossible when my brother needed help now. Cedric helped us draft the complaint, focusing on how the school failed to provide appropriate education by blocking necessary sensory accommodations. We printed it on Monday and sent it certified mail so they couldn't claim they never got it. The envelope felt heavy in my hands as I handed it to the postal worker. 4 days later, an official letter arrived scheduling an emergency IEP meeting for the following week. I scanned the agenda and my stomach dropped because sensory accommodations weren't listed anywhere. Bridger immediately typed up a formal amendment request citing federal law about parent participation in agenda setting. He sent it within an hour and copied the special education director and the district superintendent. The district replied the next day agreeing to add our items, but warning the meeting would need to be longer. At the school that week, everything got worse because somehow word had spread about what happened in special ed. Kids in the hallway would move away from me like I was dangerous, or lean in asking what really happened. I heard someone tell their friend I beat up my brother and had to be pulled off by security. Why is the CPS worker so focused on documenting every little thing about how they help their brother at home? The way she watches them cut his meatball and help with his vest makes me wonder what her real goal is here. She seems more interested in building some kind of case than understanding why these supports are needed. Another person said I went crazy and attacked a teacher, which made me want to scream at the unfairness. Bryant told me to ignore them, but it was hard when even teachers looked at me differently now. That night, I sat at my computer and started writing an impact statement from my brother's perspective. I couldn't speak for him directly, but I'd watched him for 15 years and knew his patterns. I described how fluorescent lights felt like needles in his eyes and unexpected sounds were like hammers in his skull. I explained that deep pressure wasn't just comfort, but a medical need that helped his nervous system regulate itself. The statement took 3 hours to write, and I revised it 5 times before printing it for the meeting. Meanwhile, we worked on teaching my brother to use picture cards to request pressure from the school staff. Mom laminated cards showing hands pressing on shoulders and practiced having him point to them when he felt overwhelmed. He kept reaching for me instead of the cards because that's what he'd done his whole life. We kept practicing every evening with Mom pretending to be a teacher while I stood back and coached him. She also made visual schedules showing which adults could help him at the school with photos of each aide. On Thursday, my dad forwarded me an email chain he'd gotten by accident from the principal's secretary. The administrators were discussing their real fear, which was a lawsuit from 3 years ago about improper restraint. A student had been injured when staff held him down wrong, and the district paid a huge settlement. They were scared of liability whether they let me help or not, which explained why they seemed so rigid. The emails showed they cared more about protecting themselves than helping students, but at least now we understood their position. Friday afternoon, Bridger and Cedric came to our house to prepare us for both upcoming hearings. We sat around the kitchen table, role-playing questions they might ask, and practicing our responses. They coached me to stay calm when they tried to paint me as dangerous or out of control. Cedric pretended to be the hearing officer, asking if I understood the seriousness of violating school policy. I practiced saying yes while explaining that my brother's safety mattered more than their rules. We went through scenario after scenario until my answers sounded confident without being aggressive or defensive. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep and kept checking my folders of evidence, making sure Bryant's statement was on top and the medical letters were in order. My brother must have heard me moving around because he came to my door around midnight, not saying anything but lying down next to me me on my bed and humming the first 4 notes of Mom's lullaby over and over. I rubbed his back while he hummed and tried not to think about what would happen tomorrow. The next morning, I threw up twice before breakfast, and Mom had to force me to eat some toast while Dad kept checking his watch and asking if we had everything. We got to the school early and sat in the main office waiting room for 20 minutes before they called us into the conference room, where 5 administrators sat behind a long table, looking at me like I was some kind of threat to their perfect system. The principal read from a paper about how I'd violated policy by leaving my exam without permission and engaging in physical contact with another student, then asked if I disputed these facts. I said no, I did those things, but explained about hearing my brother hurting himself and finding him bleeding on the floor while staff made it worse. Bryant's statement helped when they read it because he confirmed hearing the screaming too, but I could see the assistant principal shaking her head like none of that mattered. They asked if I understood why rules exist, and I said yes, but some rules cause more harm than good. The special ed coordinator asked if I would do it again, and I looked her straight in the eye and told her I'd break their rule every single time if it meant keeping my brother from cracking his skull open on their floor. The room went completely quiet after that, and the principal wrote something on his paper while everyone else stared at me. They sent us out to wait in the hall while they talked about it, and Mom held my hand so tight it hurt, while Dad paced back and forth for what felt like forever, but was actually an hour according to the clock. When they called us back in, the principal said they'd decided on 1 week of in-school suspension starting immediately, plus I'd have to take a makeup exam with a 10% grade penalty and write a 1,000-word essay about the importance of following school rules. It felt like they were punishing me for saving my brother's life, but Mom squeezed my shoulder to keep me from saying anything that would make it worse. 2 days later, we were back at the school for the emergency IEP meeting in a bigger conference room packed with defensive administrators who kept their arms crossed, while Bridger pulled out his laptop and started citing specific IDEA regulations they were violating by not providing appropriate sensory accommodations. The special ed coordinator kept saying, "That's not how we do things here," every time Bridger mentioned a required support, until Cedric finally interrupted to remind her that federal law supersedes whatever district preferences she had. For 3 hours, we went back and forth with them, offering tiny changes and us pushing for real accommodations while my brother sat in the corner with his aide watching cartoons on an iPad with headphones. Finally, they agreed to pilot what they called a compression protocol, where trained staff could provide deep pressure during crisis situations, and they'd bring in Chris Valdez, some BCBA consultant, for 10 hours a month to train people. It wasn't enough, not even close, but Bridger said we should take it and keep pushing for more later. The aide got reassigned to another classroom the next week, which should have been good, except her replacement was this younger woman who seemed nice but had no experience with autism, and my brother hated the change. He spent the first 3 days with her hiding under his desk and refusing to come out because transitions are always hard for him, and nobody had prepared him for losing the aide he'd had all year. Meanwhile, the CPS investigation kept going, and we had to go to their offices downtown for what they called a case conference, where 3 workers sat around discussing whether I was a danger to my brother. They decided on a safety plan that meant I couldn't be alone with him at the school anymore and had to have supervision during any contact, which the main worker said protected everyone but felt like punishment for protecting him. She kept saying the investigation would stay open for now, but there was no finding of abuse yet, which made it sound like they were just waiting for me to mess up again. A few days later, they finally trained the new aide on the compression protocol, and my brother tried it for the first time during math class when the fire alarm went off for a drill nobody warned him about. The aide tried to do what I'd shown them, but it took way longer than when I do it, and he still hit himself twice before calming down, though at least he didn't end up bleeding this time. The ban from the special ed wing stayed in place even with the new IEP because the principal said it was a disciplinary issue, not an accommodation issue. So I set up this system where the new aide would text me updates about how my brother was doing and call my mom if things got really bad. 3 days later, this mom I'd never met before stopped me in the hallway and grabbed my arm, her eyes all red like she'd been crying, and she told me her daughter was the little girl who saw everything that day and hadn't been able to sleep since. She said she'd spoken at the PTA meeting the night before about what really happened, how I was protecting my brother, not hurting him, and how the school's restraint methods had traumatized her kid, who kept asking if the boy with the blood was okay. A couple kids from my English class came up to me at lunch, and one of them mumbled something about being sorry for spreading rumors, but I could tell they still looked at me different, like I was dangerous or unstable or something, and the way teachers watched me in the halls made it clear nobody trusted me anymore. That afternoon, we got this thick envelope from the state education department with their acknowledgement of our complaint, and a timeline showing the investigation would take up to 6 months, which made my stomach drop because that meant 6 more months of my brother suffering while some bureaucrat shuffled papers in an office somewhere. Bridger called that evening and said 6 months was actually fast for the state, that most investigations took a year or more, which didn't make me feel any better about my brother having to survive until June with a system that was barely working. My parents sat at the kitchen table that night with their laptop open to real estate sites in other districts, scrolling through houses we couldn't afford in neighborhoods with better schools. And Mom kept saying maybe if they sold the car and got second jobs we could swing the mortgage, but Dad pointed out that private special needs schools cost $40,000 a year, which was more than college tuition. They looked at apartments in the good district across town, but even those were twice our current rent, and we'd have to leave the house we'd modified for my brother with visual schedules on every wall and a sensory room we'd built in the basement. Bryant caught me after class the next day and handed me a folder with makeup assignments, telling me he'd gotten me extensions on the essays and that he'd grade them whenever I could get them done. No penalty for lateness. He'd talked to my other teachers too, but some of them weren't as understanding, especially my math teacher, who said absences were absences and docked 10 points off my test grade, even though I'd left to stop my brother from cracking his skull open. The principal asking if they'd do it again feels like such a trap. What answer could possibly satisfy them when they clearly care more about their liability emails than actual student safety? My GPA dropped from a 3.8 to a 3.4 that marking period, which doesn't sound like much, but it meant losing my spot in the top 20% and probably killing my chances at the state university university honors program I'd been working towards since freshman year. The school board meeting was Thursday night, and they gave each person 2 minutes for public comment, so I practiced what I wanted to say, timing it with my phone to make sure I could fit in the part about finding him bleeding. When my turn came, I stood at that microphone looking at 5 board members in their suits, and told them exactly what I saw that day, how his blood was already pooling on the white tile, how the aide just stood there telling him to stop while he slammed his head again and again. One board member kept checking her phone while I talked, another shuffled papers, but the one in the middle at least looked uncomfortable when I described the sound his skull made hitting the floor. They thanked me for my comments when the timer went off and called the next person, some parent complaining about the lunch menu, and I sat back down knowing nothing would change, but at least it was on the official record now. Chris Valdez finally showed up the next week to observe my brother's classroom, and within 10 minutes, she'd identified 12 sensory triggers, including the buzzing from the fluorescent lights, the smell of the cleaning products they used, and the way sound echoed off the concrete walls. She wrote up this whole report recommending acoustic panels, different lighting, and a quiet corner with noise-canceling headphones, but the special ed coordinator said the district couldn't afford modifications that would cost thousands of dollars for one student. We were back to the same fight about money versus my brother's basic needs, except now we had an expert saying exactly what was wrong and they still wouldn't fix it. Week 8 finally came, and CPS sent their final letter saying the investigation was closed as unsubstantiated, but they'd noted services offered to the family, which meant somewhere in a government database there was a permanent record that I'd been investigated for child abuse. The letter said this could come up in future background checks for certain jobs, especially anything involving children or vulnerable populations, so basically my dream of becoming a special education teacher might be shot because I protected my brother from hurting himself. Later that day, the new aide texted me a photo of my brother doing his math work calmly and said he'd had a small meltdown after lunch, but the compression protocol had helped, and it only lasted 5 minutes instead of an hour. Mom saw the message over my shoulder and started crying. Not sad tears, but relief tears, because it was the first good news we'd gotten in months, even though 5 minutes of meltdown was still 5 minutes of suffering. At home that night, I watched my brother doing his homework and noticed how he kept glancing at the door every time he heard footsteps, how his whole body tensed. When Dad moved too fast, reaching for the salt, how he'd developed this new thing where he'd touch his forehead where the scars were whenever he got anxious. Sunday night was the worst because he knew school was coming and he'd pace his room humming the same 4 notes over and over, not eating dinner, not able to focus on his favorite shows, just walking back and forth with his hands pressed against his temples like he was trying to hold his head together. During my in-school suspension, I had to sit in this tiny room with no windows writing an essay about respecting school rules and the importance of following protocol, but instead I wrote 5 pages about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and cited 3 court cases about schools failing to provide appropriate accommodations. The administrator who had to read it before I could leave looked at my citations and legal arguments and said this wasn't what they asked for, but I told him it was what he was getting because following their rules meant letting disabled kids hurt themselves, and I was done pretending their policies made sense. The next morning I watched from the cafeteria window as my brother got off the bus with his new aide, who actually bent down to his eye level when he started flapping his hands instead of grabbing them like the old aide used to do. She pulled out a laminated card from her pocket, one of the picture cards we'd made showing 2 hands pressing together, and held it up for him to point at if he needed pressure. He tapped it 3 times, his way of saying he needed it bad, and she wrapped her arms around his shoulders, pressing down firm but not too tight, counting out loud to 10 like I'd shown her during the training session Chris ran last week. His body relaxed bit by bit, and by the time they walked into the building, he wasn't flapping anymore, just humming those 4 notes from Mom's song. That afternoon, Cedric called to say he'd filed the OCR complaint, explaining that having 2 different agencies looking at our case meant better odds of getting real change instead of just promises on paper. The stack of forms he'd emailed us was thick enough to print double-sided and still use up half a ream of paper, but every page felt like another arrow we were shooting at the system that had failed my brother. 2 days later, the principal caught me in the hallway between classes and steered me into his office, where he told me the district was reviewing their zero-tolerance policy for siblings of students with disabilities, acting like he was doing us some huge favor by considering that maybe family members should be allowed to help during medical emergencies. I stared at the motivational posters on his wall about excellence and integrity while he talked about liability concerns and insurance policies, and when he finally stopped talking, I just nodded and left without thanking him because basic human decency shouldn't require gratitude. The weeks blurred together after that, each day bringing tiny victories and new setbacks, like when my brother managed to use his picture cards 5 times in one day, but then had a 40-minute meltdown when the fire alarm went off during lunch, and nobody thought to warn him first with his noise-canceling headphones. Mom started keeping a binder of every incident, every success, every email from the school, building our paper trail while Dad researched other districts we couldn't afford to move to, both of them looking more tired every night at dinner. By the time December rolled around, my transcript was a mess of B's and C's instead of my usual A's, with that disciplinary action sitting there like a scar that would follow me to every college application. The guidance counselor tried to help me write an explanation for my applications, but how do you explain choosing your brother's safety over your GPA in 650 words or less without sounding like you're making excuses or asking for pity? The state complaint investigator finally showed up in January, a woman with sharp eyes who took notes on everything from the fluorescent lights in the special ed room to the locks on the sensory equipment cabinet that my brother couldn't access when he needed it. She interviewed us for 3 hours, asking about every single time my brother had hurt himself at the school, every failed attempt to get accommodations, every meeting where they'd promised change and delivered nothing. Bridger sat with us through the whole thing, occasionally pointing out when her questions suggested she'd found something significant in the school's documentation, like when she asked 3 different ways about staff training records. Mom cried twice during the interview, not big sobs, but quiet tears she kept wiping away while describing finding bruises on my brother's arms from improper restraint. February brought the best week we'd had since this whole mess started when my brother went 7 straight days without hitting himself or banging his head using his cards. And the new sensory tools Chris had gotten approved, even managing a field trip to the science museum without a single meltdown. We celebrated at home with his favorite pizza and a movie, nobody saying out loud what we were all thinking. That one good week didn't erase months of trauma or mean the fight was over. I still heard him screaming sometimes from my AP history class, the sound cutting through lectures about civil rights movements, while I gripped my pencil so hard it left marks in my palm, but it was maybe once a week instead of every day. The screams were shorter too, 5 or 10 minutes instead of an hour, which the school called progress, and we called slightly less torture. Some days I'd see him in the hallway with his aide, practicing his coping strategies, tapping his cards, wearing his weighted vest, looking like any other kid except for the way he still flinched. When the bell rang or touched his forehead where the scars were whenever someone moved too fast near him, the system had bent just enough to keep us from breaking completely, but we all knew it was held together with paperwork and threats of lawsuits instead of actual understanding, and every day felt like holding our breath, waiting to see if today would be the day it all fell apart again. Thanks for listening to me wonder about all this today. It's been really interesting sharing these thoughts with you. Catch you later. Like the video, it helps more than you think.